The air was still thick with the echoes of laughter and clinking glasses when Damian Carter stepped out into the cold night. He had stayed late at the company's holiday party, not for the free champagne or small talk, but because his boss Meredith Blake was too drunk to drive herself home. And Damian, well, he wasn't the type to leave anyone behind, no matter how cold or superior they'd been to him in the office. He was a single black father, 34, always on time, always respectful, and always underestimated. So when Meredith slumped in the back seat of his Honda Civic, mumbling half-coherent apologies between hiccups, he didn't think twice. He drove her home safely, walked her to the door, and made sure she got inside without incident. That was it. No more, no less. But the next morning, Damian found himself summoned to her corner office, facing a chilling accusation he never saw coming. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Meredith's voice sliced through the silence like a knife. She held up her phone, displaying a blurry photo of herself in bed. "A man like you in my house taking advantage of me when I was vulnerable." Damian didn't flinch. He'd seen this kind of game before, where kindness gets twisted into guilt, where skin color shapes suspicion. What Meredith didn't know was that Damian had documented everything. Every word. Every step. Every second of that night. Because in a world that still judged men like him by whispers and shadows, Damian had learned one hard truth. You don't survive by hoping for fairness. You survive by preparing for war. Damian kept his gaze steady, seated calmly across from Meredith. In the executive suite, she ruled like a queen. Her office, all glass and steel, felt more like a courtroom today, except this time the defendant was him. "Ms. Blake." Damian began, his voice level, but laced with quiet fire. "You were intoxicated. I drove you home safely, that's all." She scoffed, leaning back in her chair. Her icy blue eyes narrowed. "How convenient. The good-hearted employee offers to drive his boss home. And then, well, we know what men like you do when no one's watching." The words hung heavy in the air. Not just cruel, but calculated. And they weren't new to Damian. Over the 5 years he'd worked at Rockland Equity Group, he'd learned to recognize the looks, the quiet doubts whenever he spoke up in meetings, the way Meredith double-checked his reports while waving through half-finished proposals from white colleagues. Her words now were just a more venomous version of the same unspoken bias had endured for years. Still, he didn't bite. He wouldn't give her the outburst she was goading him toward. "I'm sure this is a misunderstanding," he said quietly. "No misunderstanding," she snapped. "You violated my privacy. You embarrassed me. And now I'm considering filing a complaint for sexual misconduct. It's your word against mine, Damian." She smirked. There it was, the power move. The unspoken truth. In a system rigged to trust power, who would believe the black man in IT over the white female executive with decades of influence? Damian leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together. "What if I told you I have proof?" Meredith's smirk faltered. "Proof," she repeated, chuckling. "What kind of proof could a man in your position possibly have against someone like me?" He didn't answer. Not yet. Just offered a faint smile. The kind of smile that doesn't come from victory, but from patience. Meredith had no idea that the night before Damian had activated the recording app on his phone the moment he found her sobbing in the restroom at the party. He had captured everything, her leaning on his shoulder as he guided her to the car. Her slurring gratitude the exact moment he dropped her off and stood at her doorstep making sure she went in safely before returning to his car alone. But it wasn't just about the party. For over 2 years, Damian had been gathering more than recordings. He had documented dozens of microaggressions, side comments, performance review inconsistencies, and patterns that stretched far beyond his own experience. He wasn't just defending himself, he was getting ready to expose the rot. As Meredith rambled on about consequences and corporate policy, Damian thought of his daughter Mia, back home, 8 years old, already asking questions no child should have to. "Why do people treat you different, Daddy?" Because some people still looked at men like him and only saw a threat. But Damian Carter wasn't just some senior analyst. He was a man forged by the foster system, shaped by military service, and driven by fatherhood. And while Meredith saw a scapegoat, someone easy to ruin, what she failed to see was that she'd just made her biggest mistake. She underestimated the one person in the room who was more prepared than she'd ever been. The tension in the room thickened as Damien stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply looked Meredith in the eye and said, "You're not the first person to play this game, but I promise you'll be the last." Later that morning, the whispers began. By the time Damien returned to his cubicle, the shift in the atmosphere was unmistakable. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Conversations hushed when he passed. The woman from HR, Jennifer Morris, showed up at his desk before he even logged into his computer. "Damien, can we talk?" In the HR conference room, Meredith sat waiting like a spider in the center of her web. Two company lawyers flanked her, polished and silent, their eyes scanning Damien like he was already guilty. Jennifer looked uncomfortable as she read aloud the complaint. Ms. Blake alleges that Mr. Carter behaved inappropriately while transporting her home after the company function. "Inappropriately," Damien said calmly. Meredith slid her phone across the table, a photo of herself lying in bed, hair tousled, barely covered by a blanket. "You put me in this position, Damien," she said, her voice syrupy with self-righteousness. "A vulnerable woman. Alone. With you." Damien studied the image coolly, then looked up. "And who took this photo?" "I did," she replied quickly. "When I woke up." Damien nodded. First lie, he thought. She didn't know he had left her house hours before that photo was taken. And she definitely didn't know that her own building's lobby security camera had logged his exit time, something he had already requested a copy of. Jennifer's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Carter, do you understand the severity of this complaint? Pending an internal investigation, you are to be suspended without pay, effective immediately." Damien nodded. "So I assume Ms. Blake's word carries more weight than mine." Meredith leaned forward, her voice condescending like she was handing down mercy from a throne. "You're a good employee, Damien. But let's be honest, men in your situation sometimes misunderstand boundaries. It happens. That did it." For a moment, Damien felt the anger rise, the same rage he'd swallowed in the army. When officers questioned his leadership, the same quiet humiliation he'd endured in college, when professors praised his surprising academic ability, the same burn he felt each time he told Mia that good people always win, even when the world said otherwise. "You mean men like me," he said slowly. "Single fathers, former foster kids. Black men who worked their way up without a shortcut." Silence. Meredith tried to backpedal, but Damien wasn't finished. "Funny," he added. "Last night you mentioned Sarah Chun. Said she tried to play the race card when she was fired." Meredith stiffened. "That's not relevant." "I think it is," Damien replied, his voice calm but sharp as broken glass. "Because Sarah spoke to me last week. She's suing this company. And she has recordings too." Meredith's face paled. "And you know what's interesting? Ms. Blake." Damien leaned in, his smile razor thin. "I have her testimony and mine. Both from people you dismissed. One black, one Asian, but neither of us invisible anymore." He stood. "I'm not here to imply anything. I'm here to expose everything." Outside the conference room, Damien didn't look back. Meredith thought she was tightening a noose, but what she didn't realize was that she'd just stepped into her own trap set, slowly, patiently, and perfectly, by the man she thought she could break. By the time Damien reached the street, the air outside felt different, charged, but not with fear. With clarity. Meredith believed she had already won. That was her fatal flaw. While she toasted her supposed triumph behind frosted glass and whispered smugly to her peers about taking care of a liability, Damien was quietly activating the plan he'd been building for over 2 years. He didn't call a standard HR rep or a cheap employment attorney. He called Amanda Rodriguez. The moment her voice came on the line, crisp and composed, Damien felt like he was speaking to a scalpel. "Marcus Williams gave me your name," he said. "Sarah Chun, too." "I've heard enough about your company to raise an eyebrow," Amanda replied. "But what do you have?" "I have evidence," Damien said. "Years of it. That afternoon, Damien sat in Amanda's office laptop, open files, perfectly organized. He wasn't just a man with a grievance. He was a technician with a blueprint. He had spreadsheets detailing racial discrepancies in performance reviews and promotion history. Charts showing how Black and Latino employees were rated lower on average than white employees with similar or worse output. Documentation of coaching sessions used to justify demotions. Slack screenshots, confidential emails with coded language, even internal complaints that mysteriously vanished from the system. Amanda scrolled through the data in stunned silence. "How long did you track this? Since I noticed the pattern." 2.5 years, Damien answered. Every dotted I. Every shifted goalpost. She clicked into a folder labeled Core Audio. What she heard next made her sit back. It was a 23-minute recording from a closed-door executive meeting. Meredith's voice rang out clearly, discussing how to protect company culture without bending to diversity pressure. Another voice joked about hiring safe minorities. The whole thing sounded like a satirical podcast, except it was real. Strategic, deliberate, and damning. Amanda's tone shifted. "How'd you get access to this?" "I worked in IT before, so I was an analyst," Damien said simply. "And when you're excluded from meetings, you find other ways to listen." He wasn't lying. Months earlier, anticipating trouble, Damien had installed a passive monitoring system that logged audio-flagged discriminatory keywords and safely encrypted everything off-site. While Meredith bragged to her inner circle about neutralizing him, she had no clue that her office, her emails, even her celebratory phone calls were being transcribed, time-stamped, and cataloged. "This is more than an HR issue," Amanda said at last. "This is a federal case. And you've got the receipts." Damien leaned back, folding his hands together. "She thought I was just another man trying to keep his job, but she threatened my daughter's future. She tried to destroy everything I built. So now I'm going to dismantle everything she hid behind." And while Meredith sipped wine in a luxury restaurant with her trusted confidant Margaret Thompson, gloating that a single Black man can't take down a woman like me, every word she spoke was being logged by the system Damien had wired 6 months ago. Every microaggression, every falsified record, every lie she believed no one would ever question. By the time Friday rolled around, Damien wasn't just ready. He was armed. And justice, it had just been given a voice. That Friday morning, Damien sat in his modest kitchen, helping Mia review her multiplication tables. She leaned across the table with a crayon in her hand, brow furrowed in thought. He smiled softly at the sight. She was the reason he had stayed composed, stayed strategic, stayed standing. "Are you going back to work today, Daddy?" she asked, not looking up. "Not yet," Damien replied, brushing her curls away from her face. "But I'm working on something important. Is everything going to be okay?" He paused, hearing more in her voice than just the question. The trust. The hope. The unspoken worry of a child who'd already learned how the world could treat her father. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, "because the truth has a way of finding its way to the light, even if someone tries to bury it." What Damien didn't say was that just hours earlier, he had delivered everything, every recording, every document, every transcribed conversation to a team of federal investigators from the Department of Justice. Amanda had made the call herself. And when they heard the depth of the data, especially Meredith's own words on tape describing her calculated efforts to eliminate problem employees, they moved quickly. By Monday, the lobby of Rockland Equity buzzed with the nervous energy of people sensing something bigger than the usual weekly chaos. Meredith began her day like any other premium latte in hand, tailored navy pantsuit pressed to perfection. She was preparing for an 11 a.m. meeting with investors when a knock interrupted her momentum. Jennifer from HR entered face pale. "Meredith, there's a situation. What now?" "Did Damien hire another cheap lawyer?" Jennifer didn't answer. She simply stepped aside. 2 federal agents stepped into the room, followed by the company's CEO, Harold Livingston. The look on his face, tight-lipped and 10 years older than it had been Friday, told her everything. "Ms. Blake," the lead agent said, presenting a badge. "I'm Agent Carter with the Department of Justice. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your management practices." Meredith's bravado cracked slightly. "I don't understand. This is about that nonsense complaint." The agent didn't flinch. He pressed play on a tablet. Her voice filled the room. A single black man against a respected white woman. Courts might be sensitive these days, but credibility still matters. Harold turned toward her, his voice nearly breaking. "Tell me you didn't say that." Meredith staggered back into her chair. The agents laid out document after document emails with discriminatory remarks, doctored HR files, performance reviews she had altered to deny promotions. They even had metadata confirming that the compromising photo shed presented had been taken 3 hours after Damien had already left her home time-stamped by her own security system. The final blow came when Agent Carter stated flatly, "We also have a signed affidavit from your assistant and audio recordings where you admit you fabricated your story to eliminate Mr. Carter." Meredith's face drained of all color. "You didn't just target an employee," the agent continued. "You orchestrated a racialized conspiracy." Harold didn't wait for her to speak. "You're done here, Meredith, effective immediately." As she was escorted from the building, the same halls she once ruled in silence now echoed with the sound of her downfall. And somewhere across town, Damien closed his laptop, exhaled, and finally allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. For him. For Mia. And for every voice Meredith had tried to silence. The day after Meredith Blake's very public termination, the media storm began. It started with a single Leakin anonymous tip, sent to a local journalist, followed by carefully released documents from Amanda's office. By noon, headlines spread like wildfire across financial and social justice platforms alike. Corporate executive fired amid federal probe into discrimination scandal. DOJ confirms racial bias investigation at Rockland Equity Group. And through it all, Damien Carter said nothing. Not to the press. Not to former colleagues who suddenly remembered his name. Not even to the neighbors who watched news vans line his block. Instead, he spent that afternoon sitting at the kitchen table with Mia, helping her complete a worksheet on American history. She had a habit of narrating her answers out loud, and when she reached the section about civil rights leaders, she paused. "Daddy," she said softly. "Why do some people think they're better than others just because of the color of their skin?" Damien looked up from his coffee mug, heart squeezing. He had fought in silence for so long for his dignity, for fairness, for her future, and now his daughter was asking the very question that had defined every battle he'd fought since the day he put on his first school uniform. He leaned forward, meeting her gaze. Sometimes baby people who've never had to struggle think the world owes them something. They confuse comfort with superiority, but that doesn't make them right. It just makes them wrong and blind. Mia nodded slowly. "So what do we do when we meet people like that?" Damien smiled. Smile full of something deeper than satisfaction. It was legacy. We show them they're wrong. Not by yelling, not by fighting, but by being smarter, more prepared, and doing what's right no matter how hard it gets. And that was exactly what he had done. Behind the scenes, Damien's work wasn't finished. His evidence, now part of a sweeping federal investigation, had prompted DOJ subpoenas into several other firms with similar hiring and promotion patterns. What had started as a personal defense was evolving into a movement rooted in data justice and lived experience. Amanda had already received calls from civil rights organizations asking to connect with Damien. A congressional subcommittee was reviewing his findings for potential legislative hearings. He hadn't asked for any of it, but he didn't turn away either, because this wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about making sure no other black father, no other overlooked employee would have to choose between their integrity and their livelihood. It was about teaching his daughter that standing up for truth is not only possible, it's powerful. As dusk settled that evening, Damien stepped onto the porch with Mia. She nestled beside him, her head against his shoulder. "Did the good people win this time, Daddy?" she asked. He looked out over this quiet street, the weight in his chest finally lifting. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered. "This time we did." A week later, Damien stood in front of Mia's school bulletin board, pinning up a flyer for the new mentorship program he'd just launched. It was small. Just a few volunteers, some borrowed library space, and a handful of laptops, but to him it was everything. He wasn't trying to become a hero. He was trying to become what he never had: a quiet force behind the scenes helping kids like Mia grow up in a world where they felt seen, respected, and ready. As he walked back to his car, a teacher passing by smiled. "Mr. Carter, thank you for everything you're doing." Damien returned the smile. "Thank me later," he said. "We're just getting started." He opened the car door, glancing at his daughter, buckled in the back seat, humming to herself as she flipped through her notebook. She didn't know it, but the future had already changed because her father had refused to stay silent. In a world where injustice often hides behind polished titles and polite smiles, your silence can be mistaken for acceptance. But the truth, integrity backed by preparation, is more powerful than any lie dressed in power. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is document the truth. Hold it steady, and let it speak louder than your anger ever could. If this story moved, you don't stay silent either. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Damien's shoes? Subscribe to our channel for more real, powerful stories where the underestimated rise and justice finds its voice. Because somewhere out there, another Damien needs to know has not alone.